Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucie Lederhendler, and I'm the curator at the Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba, where the exhibition The Problem of the Moon is up in our main gallery until June 8th. The AGSM is located on Treaty 2 territory, actually right on the eastern border at the fulcrum, where one unnaturally straight line meets another unnaturally straight line before it crosses Lake Manitoba and ends at Lake Winnipeg. In this land acknowledgement, we say that we are proud that this is the homeland of the Red River Métis, and that since time immemorial, this vast territory has been under the shared stewardship of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples. Today, though, we're having a conversation about territory making. So it's a good moment to reflect on our location and to think about property, ownership, and residence in terms of a people's history and their future. Now, I would like to invite up our panelists in no particular order, who are, as it turns out, all joining us from Tchage, Montreal, which, like Brandon, is a place of passing through and is the unceded land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. So, in no particular order, Jessie Beier is an artist, teacher, researcher, philosopher, and conjurer of weird pedagogies for unthought futures. Working at the intersection of art, philosophy, and pedagogy, Beier's research creation practice experiments with developing ecological dissensus and theoretical forms of pedagogy aimed at collective practices of negation, refusal, and fabulation. She is currently an assistant professor of art education at Concordia University in Montreal and an artist researcher with speculative energy futures at the University of Alberta, and is the author of the book Pedagogy at the End of the World, Weird Pedagogies for Unthought Educational Futures from 2023. AJ Little is a multidisciplinary artist residing in Montreal. The chosen mediums of their work vacillate, combining elements of film, textile, sculpture, and drawing. Their work primarily explores memory, depersonalization, and leftist politics through the imagery of the monstrous, the campy, and the grotesque. The themes come together expressed in a type of personal narrative, making sense of the abstract psychic ills of modern life. Mike Patten is a contemporary visual artist based in Montreal and a member of the Zagame Anishinaabe First Nation in Saskatchewan. He holds a BFA in painting and a BFA in drawing with a minor in art history from the University of Regina, and he has participated in solo and group exhibitions internationally and nationally in museums, artist-run centers, commercial spaces, and university galleries. In 2017, he was one of the laureates for the Natashan Foundation's Reveal Indigenous Art Awards. He is presently the director of the Contemporary Native Art Biennial in Montreal, a nonprofit organization with the mandate to recognize and support contemporary Indigenous art and artists. Finally, Bettina Forget is the director of the Artist in Residence program at SETI, which stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, where she facilitates the collaboration between artists and researchers, foregrounds art science research practice, and creates opportunities to disseminate the resulting art projects to a wider audience. She is a doctoral candidate in art education at Concordia University. Her research examines the recontextualization of art and science and how transdisciplinary education may disrupt gender stereotypes. Bettina's creative work focuses on space sciences, inspired by her avid engagement with amateur astronomy. She has exhibited her artwork in the US, Canada, Germany, Iceland, Russia, Spain, Singapore, and Nicaragua. Born in Germany, Bettina studied at Central St. Martin's School of Art in London, at Curtin University in Perth, and Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts in Singapore. Now, before we begin, I'll remind everyone watching that you can engage with the panel using the comment section wherever you're joining us from, and we'll be able to see and respond to those comments in real time. And as this is a conversation, I invite you to chime in at any time. So, welcome, thank you. All of these artists have pieces in The Problem of the Moon up in the main gallery. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I convened this panel in order to talk about a through line in the exhibition that I didn't notice until I looked up Jessie, who contributed a composition to a piece by Terry Allison in the show. So a piece of writing by Jessie that drew my attention to the fact that there's this really strong point of contact between all of your work that really reconfigured the way that I was approaching the whole exhibition in hindsight. And that's the projection of self into outer space in the context of ownership. And the phrasing of that is kind of intentionally awkward, so that we can think through the idea of projections that never land on anything, right? A projection without a surface, because in this case, we're starting with our nearest celestial body, the moon, but this conversation goes so much further than that. So before we go any further, if you could describe the work that you have in the exhibition for people who might not have seen it yet. AJ, can you start?
It's the rabbit in the moon and a dead version of it on the ground. I don't really know how to eloquently explain it beyond that. That's just what it is on the surface, but when I talk about it, it's infinitely more than that, and harkens back to growing up doing graffiti and carving out a place of one's own by carving out other things.
Right. So it's a circular canvas panel with a happy rabbit, and then a sculpture of a pretty mangled deceased rabbit at the bottom.
Yeah.
Thanks. Mike, why don't you go next?
Sure. I have two pieces in the show. The first one is called Colonization of the Moon, and it's a found globe of the Earth that I painted white, and it's covered with white flags. So I had kind of two ideas about that. First, I was thinking about the space race and how all the countries are coming and planting their flags and claiming territory. So I was thinking about colonization, but of space. Plus, also, I learned that because of the radiation of space, a lot of the flags that have been planted there have been bleached white. So I thought it was kind of funny to have a flag but have no color. The second piece is called Speed of Night. It's all about the expansion of space. So I created a digital animation of some significant constellations used in navigation that over time they expand and distort. So it's just really about the expansion of space and how these markers of giving us an idea of where we are in space that are changing. And yeah, those are the two pieces.
And Bettina?
I have a series of drawings at the as part of the exhibition. They were informed by my practice as an amateur astronomer. I like to sketch the moon at the eyepiece, and to that end, I use a moon atlas to sort of navigate me, because one moon crater looks very much like another moon crater, so it's good to have an atlas of the moon. And it occurred to me that all the moon craters are named after people, and I was curious about who these people are. They tend to be mathematicians, scientists, philosophers. And I noticed that out of the over 1,500 named in catalog craters, only 2% are named after women. So I made drawings of the, at the time, 30, now 32 craters on the moon that are named after women. So the piece is called Women with Impact. It's kind of a play on words, because the women after whom the moon craters are named have made a significant contribution to their field. But a moon crater is also made by an impact and describes a void. And the void is a metaphor for the absence of women in the canon of scientific history, sort of the erasure of women as we talk about who gets commemorized on the moon. And if I'm questioning whether the moon is a man's world, even though the moon is so often referred to as she.
A lot of cosmologies, and that well, I mean, it's already coming into fruition, this idea of the naming convention, the convention of planting a flag, right? And then we'll talk more about the kind of subversion of tagging, of that kind of naming convention that plays into these questions. And Jessie, so I don't want you to talk about the piece that you have. I want you to talk about these this work that I came across when I looked you up that made me think in this way.
Yeah, we've been having a few conversations, and I'm sad I don't get to see the works in the flesh, so to speak, but it's been cool to read about them and to see some of your other work out there and learn about y'all. And I see lots of resonances even from afar. And I think a lot about I have a couple essays that I think Lucie is referencing that really try and think about these kind of like weird feedback loops between abstract theories of cosmology. So this amalgam of ontological, epistemological, temporal, cosmogenic kind of elements that orient studies of the cosmos, like its origin, its constitution, its evolution, and its eventual fate. And so those abstract theories, and then the material conditions that impact life on Earth in the here and now. Like I'm super fascinated by these kind of like assumptions about cosmology and how it comes to impact, how we think about things here on Earth. And so already in your work, I see so many kind of interesting refrains, I guess, so to speak, in terms of AJ, these kind of like zones of residence and this kind of carving out these zones of residence, but that kind of frustrate, maybe taken for granted sense of like death and time. And in Mike's work, this kind of question of colonization or claiming of territories, but also this, the bleaching of the flag, these like inhuman intensities that frustrate the ownership in the first place, that kind of those same kinds of modes of ownership no longer work, or are frustrated by the kind of something like bleaching on the moon. And then Bettina's work around there, like real kind of facialization of the cosmos, which I read about in one of those papers, and in this case, the kind of like impact of gender into the cosmos. So there's really interesting things that the work reminds me of in terms of these questions of like territories, or, as some philosophers think about it in terms of like and re-territorialization. So I can give a little bit of background there because it might help give us some conversation or some language, but we can also throw it out if we don't want to use it.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about. You sent me a voice memo from the airport.
Yeah.
I was like, if I was in the airport, I would be like sidling up behind. What is she talking about? So you use the phrase territorialization specifically. You don't talk about boundary making. You don't talk about residing. You talk about territorialization. So maybe turning that into plain language. And what you said in this voice memo was you can't have territorialization without deterritorialization. Can you briefly kind of summarize what you mean by that?
Totally. And I mean, folks, we can look this up a little bit more. Thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari were thinking about this in all sorts of ways, really try and understand how kind of assemblages come together. How do things consist, right? How do things, whether it's like a social assemblage, a political assemblage, but also how we kind of understand like bodies of knowledge, these kinds of things. And it's about these creation of territories, which involves, yes, like kind of re-territorializing and then deterritorializing in the process. And so what I'm interested in where it kind of grabs me, and a lot of my work again thinks about the kind of the question of philosophy, and I keep writing about the same thing. I guess that's what you do when you're an academic, and that is like, given the current planetary situation, why and how does thinking come to matter? Like, how does thinking become material? And I think artists we're working with this. How do things become perceptive? Like how can we make something perceivable, sensible, material? And there's a thought process with it. And I mean, thinking beyond the cognitive, we think with our guts and our butts. No, I'm just we think with all parts of our bodies, and our bodies are not our own, or we are bodies beyond these kind of like bounded individuals. So then thinking becomes real messy, real complex. And I'm interested in the question of like deterritorialization in terms of how concepts kind of come to matter in the world. And so I've turned to all sorts of weird objects to think about this question of territories, how they're formed and unformed in very material ways. I've thought with things like mycelium, or like entropy in terms of energy, or speculative finance and reality TV, all sorts of things, but also black holes and cosmic sonority. So I've kind of thought a lot about sound and the sounds of outer space, and how these things have been registered by these human apparatuses so that they become perceptible or sensible to us. And in so doing, there's a kind of territorializing, because in order for us to even perceive them at the level of our sensory apparatus, we have to translate them, we have to transform them. But there's also all sorts of symbolic and representational transformations that happen in order for us to be able to relate to these kind of quite strange alien kinds of things that we experience. Black holes bend space and time in ways that our scientific laws can't quite explain. So even theorists in the Western scientific tradition have many definitions for black holes, and the problem is not that there's one good one, but that there's too many good ones. And
right.
Also, they don't know if, what happens at a black hole is that there's some sort of a shift, or if it's just the limits of our knowledge, literally the limits of our knowledge. So yeah, that's a bit. I don't know if people want to like riff on that or ask questions. It's a lot, but
I want to throw in the Deleuze and Guattari that was so useful for me is the idea of a child walking home alone, who would be frightened except that they're singing, and as far as their voice reaches is a zone that they're inhabiting. Right. This is exactly so obviously there's no sound in space. Obviously there's no light in the black hole, and so what we have done is interpret something into sound that we can hear. And so suddenly that becomes an extent. Suddenly we can see a black hole. We've imaged it so we can understand. I mean, yeah, as you say, the closest we can get to understanding the black hole is spaghetti, and then we fall apart, right? So yes, I'll let anybody else chime in there as well.
Maybe just want to riff on that. I think that's what's interesting about the concept of deterritorialization. It's beyond good or evil. It's not, I mean, this is where the ethics open up. We ask ethical questions, but the creation of territories is not fundamentally good or bad. I mean, there's questions there, who owns them? This is the conversation, and who has access to them. But whether it's the baying of wolves or a child walking home, singing a tune or whistling. I don't know if folks do that or put your headphones on, literally, to create like a zone of residence so that you have some sort of familiarity. I have the TV on in my house all the time, even if I'm not doing anything. Like I need something to fill the space. So there's a different question here, I think, around kind of like good territories or bad, and so even with the black hole or the singing of a moon, Miranda's moon, NASA has recorded lots of different kind of cosmic objects. But there's also been folks like will.i.am who have debuted his EDM hit, Reach for the Stars from the Surface of Mars. Well, that wasn't supposed to rhyme, but it did. But this is a different territorialization where it's like presenting a cosmos to us that's familiar, and therefore, in some ways, and I think of Mike's work here, something that we can extend our reach over and as a new frontier and colonize in the same way that other spaces on Earth have been kind of have been projected, so that we can kind of see them as lesser than, or something that is empty, and therefore be able to kind of come in and colonize them. So yeah, I'll stop there.
As with all these concepts, in order to even just get to the basic, it's kind of infinitely deep. So if nobody has a direct response to that, I want to also say that there is something inherently futuristic about thinking about outer space. I think specifically because it touches on the limits of our knowledge, that we can see that limit of what we do know. And so it becomes this very uncomfortable place to be, where you have to reconcile the fact that it might be unknowable, which we don't like to think about. I say we as cognitive beings. So talking about who belongs there, who owns it, and the idea of bringing back the metaphor of projection, a back projection onto a history that's correcting a misinterpretation in the present, right? So what I'm hoping to do is toss around the merits and dangers of doing it, even if it is neither good nor bad, neither good nor evil, I should say. There's merits to the way that it gets executed, right? So a really easy way to think about that for me is talking about subsets of humans, right? And how the future can repair the past. So I think starting with Mike is a good idea, and Speed of Night, which you call an antidote to isolation. So you're thinking of future isolation, but you're also projecting Kanien'kehá:ka words. The names of these constellations are significant as wayfinding that is being dissolved. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it was actually important for me to kind of link it to Indigenous history, just because it's something I've been focusing on since about 2012, since I started working with the Indigenous Biennale. Something that kind of inspires my work. So in the video, there's a Mohawk speaker speaking about the concept of the film. And it was also, when I was doing a bit of research, I had difficulty finding people that had the star knowledge. Like I wanted to situate it here because I'm on Mohawk territory. I wanted to kind of do a little bit of research and find out what the constellations mean and what they represent. and it's difficult. I think I just still have to further go and learn more, because all the things that I found mostly were from other nations or, of course, non-native. Yeah, but my video is really a projection of the future.
Yeah, as things fall apart.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking specifically about when you're looking at this futurism. I mean, similarly to Afrofuturism, it's responding directly to a recent past, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was kind of important for me to, like, I downloaded actual star data, and man, it took way longer than I thought to render, because it's really light years apart. So it took quite a while just to get it, but it was quite interesting process, because I know constellations a little bit in the sky, but I didn't really, not until you download it and you can kind of swivel around and look at it from a different perspective, or even if you're in a different point in space, like if you're looking at it from the sun versus the Earth, everything looks so much different. Just it shifts and changes and distorts. So it was just an interesting process for me too.
Yeah, I didn't realize you had used actual star data.
Yeah, I don't know how accurate it is. I think they tried their best. And of course, the projected future also, because there's so many different elements that will change the trajectory of things, those rogue planets and, other things flying through, and the colliding of galaxies, because
Sure.
we're going to hit Andromeda, I guess, in the future. So
yeah,
I've always been really fascinated with space very early on. So I was quite excited to work on something that can kind of bridge my experience with Indigenous and then that space. So it was kind of nice to put those two together.
There's an interesting thing. I don't remember if I bring this up later, so I'm just going to bring it up now. In the soundtrack by Craig Commanda. So you all are in Montreal as a rooted place, and I was for a long time. And there's a moment in the Craig Commanda composition that sounds just like the metro chimes. Mm-hmm. There's a progression of 3 notes that's at an otherwise very quiet part of the exhibition, and it always kind of triggers me, right? It kind of takes me back. So relating back to that sonic space building and a projection to the past, I think that's a really interesting thing. Very personal, but it all is. What we're talking about is all personal. Mm-hmm. Bettina, yes. You call your methodology critical toponymy. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on that and tell us how that methodology works on history and futurisms?
Well, toponymy looks at the sort of social and political implications of naming places here on Earth. And why does that matter? Why should we critically look at how we name things? And naming is a significant act. What is the impetus of why we name something? We want to commemorate or memorialize or highlight a person. So like Pierce Lewis calls this an unwitting autobiography. And I know also you quoted Lucie Lippert in the lovely catalog that you made to go with the exhibition. And I love her quote that naming is, with mapping and photography, the way we image and imagine our communal history and identity. And I think that's really important, that there's this recursive sort of feedback loop between how we shape our environment and that in turn shapes us again. So looking at it critically means that we are so investigating it, and we can remake these toponymies. Like you mentioned, that we're starting to rename streets here in Montreal, giving them Indigenous names. I think this also relates to when I give my artist talk about women with impact. Very often I do this little exercise. I ask people to imagine themselves in front of their house or apartment building, and then walk down the street, and then think about how many streets are named after women, and how many parks and how many statues depict actual women and not just like spring or motherhood, So, and then think about it and think about what that means. And I think what is interesting about that idea of toponymy is that normally we're thinking about our immediate environment, but the human landscape is expanding. now we are reflecting onto the moon as well. So we're starting to name things on the moon, so that toponymy is reflected onto a celestial body that we normally only notice because it's reflecting sunlight, but it's also reflecting our cultural, sociological ideas or political ideas. And even though you mentioned that when we're thinking of space exploration, it's really futuristic, imagining sci-fi and astronauts and spaceships that we haven't invented yet, that kind of toponymy is putting on the brakes. It's slowing us down. This is kind of lassoing us back and say, until somebody notices. And there were people saying, why do you bother with like drawing moon craters named after women? Why is this relevant? And I was like, well, the reason that you're asking me this question is kind of relevant. It's obviously relevant because and people are saying like, oh, maybe it's because people on the moon are named after scientists and philosophers. There aren't many, it's like really only 32 female scientists in the world ever since antiquity have existed. Do a cursory Google search, female scientists, and it'll be more than 32, I promise you. So we have this opportunity to reshape the narrative. And there are women like Catherine Naish, who's a planetary scientist, who's working on craters and also on moon craters, who's really like leaning into the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, who decides what gets named everywhere in the cosmos. And she wants to have more moon craters named after women. And there's apparently, an effort being made, but at this rate, we had 2%. And if, we have a long way to go. So astronomy teaches you to appreciate long time scales, but I would like to see more progress. So at least with artwork, you can do a lot. I call it protest by celebration. So at least I'm putting this in front of you and, discuss. So I think that's, that the idea that the moon isn't terra nullius, but that we're already projecting our ideas onto it is something that we should notice and reflect upon.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's something interesting about your process as well, which is that you use analog techniques to create portraits, you call them.
Yes.
So you're not taking for granted that these things exist. You're looking at them and drawing them with features that exist, whatever their names are. There's another naming convention of celestial objects that get named after the scientists who discover them, the people that discovered them, which the comet that Jessie talks about in her 2017 paper, which does kind of imply that they don't exist until they get seen by somebody with a name, right?
You get to name it. You get to name it. The IAU actually has a list. They have a committee that is specifically exists to name things on the moon. And there's a list to draw from. And who gets on that list is something that I question. And I talked to somebody at the IAU and they're going, no, it's fine. And, we're taking this very seriously. At the next IAU, we're going to have a women's luncheon to talk about, these problems. Already when I heard the terminology women's luncheon, it's like, okay, I know where the wind is blowing here.
Yeah, for sure. So a different sort of naming convention is something that AJ addresses in the piece, which is titled, I don't know if we said, Getting Up, 15 kilometers south of James Bay, 12 kilometers south of James Bay. So you might need to define getting up, but also this subset of people, this kind of historical memory. Yours is much more individualized because it's more about codes of conduct and individual disenfranchisement that you're working with within graffiti culture. And you've even referenced ideas of immortality, which I think is really interesting, just juxtaposed to Bettina's work. So how do you think about the traces of this culture getting up in relation to the future on a personal scale?
Well, when you think about it contextually of what graffiti artist is, graffiti art is, it tends to be shoved in its own ear a lot. So you're existing in the past as well as the future, and you're carving out a name for yourself by constantly posting up a name, like you're giving yourself naming rights essentially. And there is no future. you're doing it all in the moment. It's about the moment, because eventually everything is covered up and it becomes a palimpsest of sorts. So it's easy to see the void of it, and you're not going to necessarily think about the future, just the exact moment you do it, and then that exists in the past, the present, and the future.
Right. So by taking away anything except for the present.
Yeah.
There was something in your orb. Well, the flatness of the moon was kind of a hallucination that you experienced. Again, to that metaphor of projection, where it became a hole in space instead of a body in space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about that as far as plastering a name on there?
It's hard to think about because it was kind of a psychedelic experience. So it was like understanding your identity through a pinhole. Like it is a reflection of you.
I guess the reason that I'm bringing it up now is because of the, like, so the kind of universal that Jessie's dealing with, and then the increasingly identity informed things that Bettina and Mike are dealing with. Yours is so personal, but
Yes.
it's part of this very large culture, which actually makes it the closest to a universal, right?
Yes, but the culture has all of these subsets and rules that I don't necessarily, well, I'm not necessarily able to ascribe to anymore. Like, as I don't continually post up a name, as my hands deteriorate and I'm not able to hold a can, I am further outside of the culture, which is why it is also, I created a piece with my friend whose larger art practice is about these kind of floating orbs, and it was remembering this existence and viewing it as a moon, and our relationship being reflective of what drew us to art in the first place, which was graffiti. Yeah, it's, as a subculture, it has this hierarchy and individualism that exists in its rules, but in its practice, it becomes devoid of all that, because it just gets covered up over and over again. And it's about making the statement, and the statement can be a reflection of you, but it's not necessarily what you are, because it's an identity that you are projecting, not the identity you live.
Right. So you can't hold anything precious, including your identity being into this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Now we skipped over Carrie Allison's contribution to the exhibition, so that we could talk about this kind of sonic space at this point in the conversation that happens in the gallery. I don't think any of you had ever visited, but it's very echoey. It's a large space without any acoustic considerations. So it's a very echoey space, and the competing sounds are Craig Commanda from Speed of Night, and across the gallery, Jessie's composition and Carrie Allison's stop motion animation, My Moon. And they're different speeds, and they just start in the morning and run all day. So there are occasionally moments when there's absolute cacophony, which I find super interesting. Specifically, as I said, there's sometimes a little Montreal triad that happens in the middle of Jessie's swell. Thinking about the sonic territories in that space is a really interesting thing, because you're kind of split. Your attention is so split. So, Jessie, if you picture that crescendo of your composition extending all the way to the other side of the gallery to the point that it becomes distracting, right? Or really attractive, right? Really compelling. Can you talk about what you were trying to achieve, kind of the conversations that you and Carrie had with this extrasonic level in terms of what she was doing with her video as well?
Yes, I'd love that. And maybe I can riff. I hope we can riff and jam a little bit. I love hearing all of you speak. It's so awesome. And Lucie, the problem of the moon, I want to hear if we have time at the end. I mean, there's something interesting. I think a lot about this question of like problematization, where, you know, it's a problem is not something like to overcome necessarily, but how like life poses problems, like all life, not just that limited to the human. This is how life is generated, you know, the complication. There's complication in terms of the problematizing force of life in like organisms, cells, machines, sound. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so many cool things happening between all of your works in terms of, I keep asking myself, like, what does the moon problematize for y'all? And there's so many interesting resonances there, like histories and futures, which even the line of history and future is being problematized, by, like, as Bettina said, and AJ, like this question of like a more imminent or aeonic sense of time, not a chronological sense of time, a time that kind of emerges in an instant and then disappears, but remains through palimpsest or like the erasure. As well as collectivity. I mean, all of the work, there's a collectivity, kind of a question of collectivity, where the collective is like not just about interpersonal connections, but this kind of like resonances with these other cosmic intensities and histories and frequencies. So yeah, one way I try and think about this is literally just with sound, because sound is trippy. Like as a material force and a conceptual force. Like you're saying, in a room, there's a literal physical kind of quality to sound in the way we are able to hear it with our limited perceptual capacities. I just mean limited in a sense that we can hear differently than an animal, for instance, or even all of us can hear differently, or some folks can hear with their body differently, differently abled people. And so sound does all sorts of things physically, and then it also plays all sorts of conceptual things and jogs our memory, or like hits us in the guts, or like reminds you of something. And so when Carrie and I were talking about the animation, and just as a little preface, and I would love, I mean, Carrie's unable to be here. We had some chats before this talk just to touch base. She has another new person in her life, like another new child in her life after her moon. And so she created a 7-minute animation that was originally soundtracked with the 7 minutes of breathing, her new child breathing. And so you hear a regular sense of breathing, but of course, if you zoom in, it's irregular, just like all of our breathing. It's not exactly regular. And so she sent this piece, but she wanted to do something different with the sound. It was just straight up kind of the sound she had recorded. And so we talked a lot about the mood and the vibes and the relationship between like sound and music, because there is some kind of musical kind of qualities to that piece, which I can speak to, but also like sound being this kind of like unformed material of expression that creates these different territories, and thought a lot about cycles and a lot about circles and cycles and spheres. And sound does this interesting thing in how it emanates in a sphere, but of course you can never really pin down a sphere of sound, because as soon as it touches another frequency or wave or material, then that sphere is broken or changed. And so there's so many beautiful ways that sound has helped me think about territories and the impossibility of thinking about territories, or where they begin and end. And so from those conversations, we did some very kind of more protocol things. I'm thinking of your work, AJ. There's like constraints create a sense of free, or there's a question of constraint and freedom in some of these things. And then when a constraint kind of provides an openness, and when it kind of limits something. But we worked with samples. So she also sent me the sound of her unborn child in her womb, which also had a windy sound, sounded like being like a mic that doesn't have a sock on it, like just wind and kind of, and then we also listened to some sounds from NASA, some of the NASA open source sounds of the moon, which again sound quite windy. And we thought that was really interesting, that the sounds in her womb were very similar to the sounds of the moon. I'm just gonna rhyme all day. And so, yeah, so we gathered some samples, and then I took those away, and I developed things the process of developing is really based in these kind of questions of territories too. So I work in a DAW where I can kind of see things and hear things, but I can also zoom in ways. I'm thinking of the star data, Mike. Like you can like take this data and like look at it from a different. It's still this kind of model, but when you look at it from a different vantage, something else emerges. So with sound, I can like stretch the wavelength in a way where I can literally like, and then it's slow, and I can hear it differently. And when you layer things, you start, all these other refrains started to come out. So the music that you hear, the actual chords that I chose, were things that I kind of heard as those other sounds were combined, like certain harmonies emerged. And so I played with those. And then I worked with things like arpeggiators, which break down a chord into individual notes to kind of break things apart and bring them back together. And then we talked so much, like, will there be a loop? Will it end? When is the end? When is the beginning? The animation starts and ends, not at a start and end, or like it frustrates the idea.
It's infuriating, yeah.
Yeah, great. Dreadful, maybe.
Yeah.
So there was lots of technical things. And again, this was a way to kind of materially think about some of these questions of how territories are created. And then there's maybe interesting thing I'm curious to hear other folks speak about. It also doesn't mean just anything goes. There was some like kind of decision making, and maybe this is where a question of like an ethico-aesthetics come in, and like beyond good or evil, but also certain territories create certain impacts, right? Like certain traces, leaves, impact things in different ways. And so we were trying to zoom in between the kind of very personal, her personal anxieties and fears and stories that she speaks about and you speak about in the essay. And then this broader cosmological question of like relationship between like anticipation, letting go of control, of the like recognizing limits and what you can know. And so I think of all your work too, there's a personal resonance for all of y'all, but you're referencing these kind of quite cosmic registers to kind of maybe show how the person inside all of us is this kind of like cosmic, there's kind of like a folding of the kind of cosmic into our bodies in different ways, which is interesting. I'll stop there.
I like the word dread when you're talking about this as well, because it is so personal and it's so out of your control, even though it's completely yours, right? And this video, The Breath, she also described it to me as all that you can do to make sure that your side child is still there is listen for the next breath and the quality of that breath. And if it's not good, I gave myself goosebumps saying it, this idea of the dread. So I'm interested in how all of these processes of expansion, of expanding one's sphere of influence, can we say, are nouns and verbs, right? The traces of the thing that's left and the action of laying those things, thinking about tag and tagging, the name and the naming. And then especially in the joke of Mike's sculpture, The Colonization of the Moon. So looking up the first thing, the most common, reliable thing when you look up how many flags there are on the moon is a report from NASA's archives that states I think there's 6 flags on the moon. They just get planted as a purely symbolic act, right? And it's so ridiculous. Like, what else could they possibly be other than symbolic, So all of these purely symbolic things, right? The naming, the tagging, are also things that are profoundly important to our lives, because the important thing to us is how we see ourselves. So you make an art, and then you have an art, right? So where do you see the function of those objects that you're making, or the function of the making of those objects in drawing out the truth behind these symbols? I know it's an impossible what is art kind of question, but if anybody has any thoughts about those.
Well, maybe I can talk a bit about the SETI Institute's approach to this.
Mm-hmm.
So I run the Artist in Residence program there, and I asked Jill Tata, who's one of the founders of the SETI Institute, like, why did she allow this bunch of crazy artists running around with these very serious scientists and bugging them? And she said that the search for life beyond Earth requires us to conceive of the inconceivable, because we don't know what alien life may be like. We have the tendency to anthropomorphize, but when it becomes really interesting, you really want to see something else. So how do you conceive of the inconceivable? And she says, we need to use our imagination, and artists are uniquely trained to be imaginative. So therefore, the contributions of the Artist in Residence programs are actually incredibly valuable to the scientific researchers, because even just the questions that the artists arrive with, the conversations that happen, the new ideas that are being catalyzed through these conversations, and then you've got artworks coming out of it. And even though the AIR program is nested under outreach, as so often in art science collaboration that happens, as though art is a hand made into science because we're doing all this outreach. But what I'm really interested in, what happens at the Institute, is that artists are basically part of the research. And I think that is really exciting. And it's not, for me, it's not a cosmic horror. For me, it's like this, throw yourself into the unknown. As art educators, we know that we want to lean into uncertainty and then lean into that space. It's really uncomfortable when we're experimenting with our work. And I find that scientists do that too. They always ask the questions that they can't answer yet and hope that they get there. So maybe because at the SETI Institute, questions like, are we alone in the universe and what is the nature of life, are already a little bit philosophical and lend themselves more to artistic practice. But I think that's when you are intersecting research practices, that's when it gets really interesting, because you really want to explore the territory. You get to rename everything.
I'm thinking I hadn't made this connection before either, but SETI famously is listening to the cosmos. Which is they're letting themselves be the center of things that are coming towards them, as opposed to projecting their territory off.
Yeah, and when you're up at the Allen Telescope Array, we've got the 42 huge radio telescopes, and they are in a very quiet zone. When you drive up there, you can't even have your phone on you. It needs to be super, super quiet. So there's that silence, that radio silence. You feel like you're cut off from the world, but it's also really dark. And there's also these massive radio dishes. So already that idea of scale and having these big ears, and they have wild rabbits there and they have these big ears, which kind of connects. We should get AJ up there so they can have a look at all the rabbits that scoot around the radio dishes. So yeah, it's listening and being open to the new.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Move on to my next question.
I'm thinking so much. Thank you, Bettina, all of you, about this idea of like, what does art do? I don't know. We probably all ask this every day when we wake up in the morning, like, what am I doing? But I think there's something about this question of like, how does perception itself become habituated, right? Schools do this. This is what my main interest is in terms of like my work. I kind of think a lot about pedagogy, like how is our perception habituated, and not in an ideological way, but it becomes ideological. And what has to be affirmed and then obscured for that perception to kind of hold in that way. And what happens when you have an experience that exceeds that? That happens with art or film or music. You have an experience and you like try to explain it to your friend or your lover or something, and you can't, because you try and explain it in an artist talk and you can't, because there's something about being with the art, seeing the art, experiencing it, that even the artist doesn't know what's going to happen, which is the risk maybe of making art. And so I think I'm so curious about like not just what art, how it kind of like dilates perception or like reorganizes the sensorium in ways that might open up, and maybe that's good. It's not inherently liberatory. I don't think things can also destroy us in certain ways, but more about like, how do you sustain an encounter with that limit point? Because there's also a threshold where like we can't explain it. We can't know it in a language or something, or like, And that's that's the horror. When I think of, we write about this idea of cosmic horror, and I know you want to go there, Lucie, is like, for me, it's the horror, not just the unknown or the monstrous or all these, like Lovecraftian, the horror at the edge of our kind of consciousness, but the horror of a limit point, which is, and our progressivist, extractivist, like go, and by our, I mean like a certain kind of like power, colonial petro-capitalist power that's installed in me too, in my identity in all sorts of ways, is like, there's no limit. You could do, and so the thought of a limit point to me is an interesting way to think about this cosmic horror, and not that the cosmos doesn't exist, but just that we might not be able to access it. Like, we might not be able to access it. And then that doesn't mean we should stop, or like, I'm so interested, Bettina, in this work. I don't think that's the point of knowing everything, right? It's instead being able to kind of encounter the edges of those, of our kind of own ignorance or something like that.
Yeah, and steering right into that ignorance. Because when you're making a mistake when you're comfortable. And so you were sending out a golden record, assuming that aliens have ears. Or can have eyes to read the instructions on how to build that record player. So it's just so anthropocentric. Yeah. And what is really fun is our artists are going like, well, what if time didn't exist? Let's make an artwork about that. So really always question our perceptions of like how we perceive time and how we perceive sound waves, and how if you just tweak something just a little bit, what could happen? Yeah.
And like a normative human on the Voyager record, they have the man who's doing the male, and the woman is kind of like, and it assumes a certain kind of like able-bodied, bipedal, like standing up person, human. The human is kind of reified into this form, which is not, how the human emerges as a kind of historical concept in that way. But
yeah, and also, why is it a human? When we think of earthlings, we think human, but every duck, every tree, every coconut is a human, also is an earthling, so there are gaps in our thinking as well.
I have a question about like gaps in thinking. Like everybody's work is kind of concerned or utilizes the material reality of the thing. What about something that's invented from whole cloth, like Sun Ra? Like that implies the entirety of space to me, but that doesn't really have anything to do with the material reality of it. Are you guys interested in that, or just kind of mapping out using reality?
Are you talking about the institute, AJ, or are you asking?
In general, like everyone across the board.
And you're referencing Sun Ra and the orchestra, right? The Afrofuturist artist.
Yeah. Well, because you did the music of the spheres using breath, and that implies like a larger world, and it he did that as well, and like that is very representative to space to me, but has almost nothing to do with it. And I was wondering if you guys get to the same place thinking about things in an abstract manner, or if it is like looking at the craters, mapping star data, using the music of the spheres.
Yeah, I think sometimes the thing is the starting point. Like the Moon Atlas for me was the starting point in my question about it, but then it very quickly becomes something larger. And that's what drives the project, like the bigger questions about like, wait a minute, like who owns the moon? Why do we project territories onto anything? That's true with Michael's constellations are also fascinating. Why is it Cassiopeia and Hercules and all these Greek myths? And then looking through interpretations of other cultures and how they sometimes see the same constellations or they see the clusters differently and what stories are attached.
I meant that do you get there from thinking about something completely different, or is it always the starting point of the material? Like, is it always like this hard and fast thing that you're exploring, like leads you to the bigger question, or do you start with the bigger question sometimes?
For me, it's hard to say because they run in parallel and they overlap, and it's just, I guess, a black hole because there's a lot of spaghetti in there. And like really untangle where ideas come from. It's not that neat. But I think there's like this chain reaction sometimes when you think about something that makes you think about a non-related other thing, and suddenly a project emerges.
In tandem.
Your question is beautiful, and it's or like maybe your question is articulating the thing you're trying to ask, or of course around the like, where does a thought start?
Yeah.
Where does the thought start? And that's so hard. And it's also raises questions around proprietary, like the proprietary nature of thinking. Like, this is my idea. I had this idea, but of course it comes from like, can things be born in a vacuum? Are things born in a vacuum? Is space a vacuum? Like, or are there like these frequencies? And then the question, like, can we even know that there are, or like, can we even sense the ways that things are connected? I think about different forms of governance, and like in what I've learned from my friends who come from different Indigenous backgrounds too, around the kind of like way in which just to think about relations, like the ways that those things have been kind of habituated for myself, like as a settler, a white settler on this land, that it's like, I don't know how to, if it's as simple as kind of just like knowing differently, and that changes something. So there's also the question of like, where does a thought come from? Where does it start? But how do thoughts change? And then how do we like communicate that? And maybe this is these questions that everyone's asking around the like projection of a self into the cosmos, because maybe there's a projection there, but without an answer. And then maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay. I don't know. I'm thinking of your, AJ, did you see the portal that they made between New York and
Yeah.
Did you think about that at all, or have you been thinking about it?
A little bit, but it descended into like lewd gestures and like OnlyFans showing up that I was like, what does this mean?
Right? This is interesting. If all the things to communicate,
this
is what the communication was. So this will be the next thing we send.
It's like spectacle. So I wound up like reading Guy Debord again and was like, what's going on in my brain that I have to figure out why the first instinct is to just throw the middle finger or show your tits.
Yeah.
I think there's something really interesting to, it's more likely that I think any person on the street would have tried to meditate by thinking about the end of infinity, the end of the universe, and then their head hurts and they recoil from that. Then that you'll find somebody who is accepting that emptiness, that disinterest as a point, because you can't connect with it. Specifically, you can't. All that we can recognize is change and alterity and presence, right? I think about this with the ocean quite a lot. We occupy things, right? We create sea monsters for the doldrums. We give them names and pinpoint phenomena. But I think the entry point into the limits of human understanding is much more about what happens when you have nothing to focus on, right? Just continuing. That's what AJ's question is making me think of. I'm trying to post the portal in case people don't know, and I just typed the words that I said instead of the caption I'm trying to write. So I'm going to try this actually first. That's better, right? In the title is specifically from a 2017 paper. I'm sorry, I'm not giving a shout out to your co-author enough, but I have forgotten their name. But
Jason Wallin, yeah.
The cosmic horror is the revelation of immense and inhuman timescales, dark materials, energies outside of our traditionally recognizable reality. So that's just, oh, look, something exists outside of my reality, but it's horrifying. It's dreadful because of the inhumanness of it, right? And interrogating that made me think much more about AJ and Araya's piece, which by using that kind of lowbrow aesthetic, right, that accessing that culture, which I know is AJ's jam, connects it with that genre of horror as well,
Mhm.
and links to the idea that maybe I don't belong here at all, which obviously is a deeply political thing for any individual, especially somebody who's part of a historically excluded community, presently excluded community, to reckon with. AJ, talk about that.
Talk about being alienated.
Alienated, but also the link of this kind of we're talking about highbrow horror, and we're talking
Yes.
about lowbrow horror, and how the helplessness of the individual plays into both of those things.
Well, I don't think there's necessarily a division. One can inform the other. Like lowbrow horror is more of just a sly way of saying what you really mean and putting distance between you and the cosmic terror that is existence. And it forces you to look at kind of an unfeeling cosmos, or look away from an unfeeling cosmos and kind of get more granular. Like, we're afraid of the dark, we're afraid of the thing chasing us, we're afraid of all of these things. Actually, in the film Nightmare on Elm Street, the entire crux of the plot is turning your back on the thing to take its power away. So I think that can be a way of assessing like the inhumanness outside of your sphere. Is you're just concentrating on what you can see, experience, and the more granular aspects of life.
Yeah.
Why paint on walls?
Yeah. Well, I mean, because it's funny then, because graffiti is illegal, right? It plays into kind of the broken window theory, and so some people would be terrified of this, and then the anecdote that you're offering is like there's a really interesting optimism, dread in this action, right? Yeah.
And I think they can only exist in tandem.
Yeah.
Like, if you meet anyone who does graffiti, it is about that thing.
Yeah. Okay. As I said, I'm in control, so I don't care that we're over the hour mark, but this is my last question. So I'll finish by asking all of you, is a disinterested cosmos different than an unwelcoming cosmos? If so, which is worse? And is reckoning with that a warning, a call for caution, or a call to action? I'll ask Michael to answer first.
I thought it was interesting when William Shatner went up to space after portraying a space traveler for so many years. And once he encountered the coldness of space and then just the lack of life or anything, how much appreciation he has of the Earth that we have. I think about that often, of how unhospitable it is out there. Of course, we don't know. We don't know what's out there completely. But yeah, that's the big question. We don't know. So I guess there's that anxiety over that. But I think it's important to also focus on what we have, and what's important is our future. So we got to really focus on what's happening here.
Yeah, I want to jump to Jessie, because you said maybe these prevent us from taking care of the present. That's something that you mentioned when we were talking.
Yeah, a lot of my work thinks about the future. Education is, I write a lot about pedagogy and education, and so much of education is relentlessly oriented to the future, a future that's out of sync with the current situation. And so, I don't know, things are real rough out there, and I am buffered from so much of it. And so I think about this question of optimism and pessimism. I've written a lot against hope, but not because I'm like a very optimistic, positive person, but I think it's a trap. Hope is a trap. It distracts from kind of things happening. And so I've kind of advocated for this question of a certain kind of pedagogical pessimism, and drawing on folks like Eugene Thacker, who write about a cosmic pessimism. And I'm hearing this, AJ, and I can send you some stuff if you want, but no pressure. But he writes about, he comes from the lineage of philosophical pessimism, but writes about a cosmic pessimism, which I feel like y'all are, like there's a reference to it, and it's beyond good or evil again, and it's about kind of this pessimism of the cosmos that requires like a drastic scaling up or scaling down of the kind of a human point of view. And then, but there's an inhuman orientation of time and space, but there's also a recognition of the impossibility of ever accounting for that. So you, at the same time that you're like, whoa, you can like look at these things from like these wild different vantages, there's also like a recognition that there's a limit point or an impossibility of ever kind of coming to terms with it all, whether you're going real finite and granular, or real, you know, wild, big and deep time, Deep Space Nine. No, I just can't stop rhyming. And so this, for me, this is a humbling thought. Instead of it I mean, there's a horror to it, but I wonder if the horror can be also like taken in and like metabolized as a sort of humbling thought. And especially for in education, so much of education is founded on progressive thinkability. If we can think it, if we can know it, we can solve it, we can do something differently. And I just don't know if that model works in the same way, or if it ever did. So what would pedagogy of like, what would a sustainable pedagogy, for instance, be, instead of sustaining the status quo, about like sustaining the like discomfort and pain that comes with acknowledging this kind of humbling thought of limits? For me, it's like not indifferent or unwelcome, but a kind of humbling reminder of both our kind of insignificance and therefore our power in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. Bettina, do you have any thoughts?
I think the term unwelcoming just means unwelcoming to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
It may not be unwelcoming to another species. Other species might be perfectly happy on planets that don't have an oxygen atmosphere, because oxygen is actually poisonous to most things. And there wasn't even oxygen on our planet for the first couple of billion years. And we're the weirdos, we're not the norm. I think it's really, I love when Jessie mentioned the term humbling. I think if you're a real explorer, after knowledge, not after extraction, if you don't arrive at a planetary body, said, what can you give me? But if you arrive there and said, what can you teach me? You know, that requires that you're humble, and that you are, you know, looking for knowledge and letting go of your preconceived ideas and your requirements. Maybe you don't have to go in person, send a probe. You want to make your own footprint, and it would be so much cooler if we could go to Mars in person. But machines are able to capture sound waves and chemicals that our limited, puny human bodies can't, because we weren't designed for those environments. So, you know, please remember that evolution exists. But we can use technologies to extend that if we're really curious. But for me, it's like, what is your leading question for exploration? Is it, you know, manifest destiny? Is it because you really want to get richer and billionaires no longer enough for you? Or are you just really curious and you want to answer this question, are we alone in the universe? Which is really a question about ourselves. You know, as you're trying to define alien, you're really delimiting the edges of what human is. And I think that, you know, if you keep that in mind and then think about what happens beyond our atmosphere, I think that's when things get really interesting.
AJ, last word to you.
I'm, whatever the case, I'm used to going where I'm not welcome and indifferent to. So either way, I'm excited to look up.
That's as good a place as any to end. Thank you all so much. I'm happy to have introduced neighbors. I hope you see each other at the supermarket. And anybody watching at home, Problem of the Moon is on in the main gallery until June 8th. If not, you can visit the website, read the exhibition essay, and learn about all of these fabulous artists at your leisure. Thanks so much once again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody. Yeah.
Great chat. Bye.